What's up? I'm FusePS. This is FusePS Says, and in today's video we're going to be doing part 3 of the coffee table tutorial. So for this video we're going to be going through CAM, how to set something up. We're going to specifically talk about setting this up in the flip operations. I'm going to talk about how you deal with having a super thick piece of stock. And in my case, because my wood is warped, I've got a much thicker stock than I need. I need to face it down to flatten it out so it's not warped anymore. So with that said, let's jump right in. So in the last two tutorials, we went through basics of sketching as well as some advanced sketching techniques, 3D modeling, importing parts from McMaster-Carr, and linking files together. So for today's workshop tutorial, we're going to focus exclusively on setting up the CAM toolpaths and the strategy that I use to make this thing. So the first thing I'm going to do is change my workspace. So if I click from Model and go over to CAM, that's going to bring me over to the CAM workspace. And you'll notice that the legs disappeared. And the reason that the legs disappeared is that when I set this up earlier on, I made sure that the visibility was switched off for the legs in the CAM workspace. Fusion remembers that, so that when I switch between CAM and Model, my visibility is only going to be the parts that are relevant to what I need to look at. All right, so the first thing we've got to do is create a new setup. So we're going to go to Setup, a new setup. And first thing you'll notice is you've got this little coordinate system that appears as well as a yellow bounding box around your object. Now the coordinate system here is also the positioning and the relative orientation of your part in the machine. Z is always going to be the orientation of the tool. So as it stands right now, the tool is coming in at the side, and basically we're telling Fusion that this whole thing is sat on its edge. Obviously that's incorrect. So the first thing I need to do is just click on the little stem of the Z arrow here. And then if I pick any vertical edge in my model, it's going to reorient my coordinate system, and I can flip that up. Next thing you're going to want to do is set your coordinate point here. That point is going to be the 0 in the machine when you run this operation. So some people like to run from the center of their stock, some people like to run from a corner. Me personally, I prefer to run from the corner, so I'm going to put my stock point over here. Now I've picked the bottom rather than the top. The reason I picked the bottom is the shot bot that I have has an auto Z leveler on it, which runs to the bottom of the machine. So that enables me to know that I've consistently got the same Z height no matter what. If your machine doesn't have auto Z leveling, or it's a smaller machine, you may want to work from the stock top. I also recommend doing that if you're working with plywood, because plywood's not always the same thickness the whole way through. It can actually vary a little bit. So my Z is in the right place and it's oriented correctly. Next up is the actual stock itself. So if I click on my stock tab over here, you'll see the mode right now is set to relative size box. And if I hover over it, you'll see the different options you've got. In my case, I want to use a fixed size box because I know the size of my stock. Now that I've switched over, you'll also notice that my units are in inches. Well, the reason my units are in inches is I'm in the Boston build space and all of the tools in there are in inches, or in imperial or English, depending on where in the world you are. So it makes life easier for me to just switch my units over to inches. However, just to point out to you, if I go to my model, you'll notice that my model units are still in millimeters. I designed and modeled all of this in millimeters, but because my CAM environment is going to be using an American system, I've switched the units specifically to the CAM workspace to inches. So with that in mind, let's just set this up. Go over to my stock, use a fixed size box, and I know that my X is 65 inches, my Y is 24 inches, and my Z height is 1.75 inches. Now with that done, you'll see that the stock, the piece that you're cutting is stuck right in the middle of the object. That's not really a good idea because it's just making the two end pieces not as usable as they could be if it was one large part. So the first thing I'm going to do is change my model position for X to be offset from the left side and set my offset to 1 inch. So you can see everything is just nice and neat. It's close and tucked up against that side, and we're only really using, we're only wasting 1 inch of width on the side, which factors in for the width of the tool anyway. The next thing I'm going to want to do is the model position, the orientation in the Z height. So right now I'm slap bang in the middle. I actually want to move closer to the bottom because I have a little bit of warp in my wood, and it's bowing like this. So I want to move closer to the bottom and face the top off to flatten the whole thing out so that I know that the actual top of my part is going to be nice and flat. So to do that, I'm going to change my model position for the Z height, not to be from the center, but offset from the bottom. And I'm going to set my offset to 1/4 of an inch. So you'll see that we've moved much closer to the bottom with only 1/4 of an inch between me and the base. That leaves 1/2 inch on top, which is what I'm going to face off. So I can just hit OK on that. Let's move to the home view. And the first thing I'm going to do is go over to 2D and then face. Now the first thing you're going to need to do is select the tool. So I'm going to hit select here. I've prepped a few of these tools ahead of time, but if you need to create your own tools or you've bought some and you want to add them to your library, you can click on your local library here and hit this plus button and go through this and start to fill out what kind of a bit it is as well as the measurements here. I've done this ahead of time, so I don't need to worry about it. I'm going to do my 1 1/4 inch face mill and hit OK. Next up, I'm going to switch off my coolant because I don't have any coolant with the machine. And then you would go through and do your feeds and speeds. Now for this tutorial, we're not going to go through feeds and speeds because, well, that's relative to the machine you're using. It's going to be relative to the bits that you're using as well as the material that you're cutting. And I could fill this in, but it's only going to be specific to the piece of wood that I'm using as well as the machine that I'm using and the bit that I'm using. So if you're doing this for the first time, set your toolpaths up, but before you hit go and cut, go speak to the technician who's running the shop and get them to look through the feeds and speeds with you to make sure it's all dialed in and accurate. Right, next thing I want to do is go over to my passes and I want to set my step over. So the step over is basically defining the horizontal step over between the passes. So you can see in the little thumbnail here, it's demonstrating to you, it's essentially changing the width between each one of those pass levels. Now currently it's set to 1.1875, meaning that there's barely any step over between each pass. Now if I'd set my step over to 1 1/4 inch, that would mean that as the bit goes around one way and comes around to the other side, it's going to move a full 1 1/4 inch across and then come back down. Now, that might save you some time, but that's also going to leave tool marks on the top because you're not crossing over. You're just assuming that the machine is going to perfectly bring the thing 1 1/4 inch across. So what I'm going to do is just change that to 1 inch, and then I'm going to set a multiple depth. I can't just cut 1/2 inch off in one hit. The machine wouldn't be able to do it, my cutter wouldn't be able to do it, and I would wreck my wood in the process. So I'm going to set a step down here, and I am going to use 1/10 of an inch and hit OK. So with that done, you'll see that I'm milling the entire length of my stock, and I've got 1/4 of an inch step down, 1/10 of an inch step down between each one of those passes. Now the reason I'm doing the whole piece and not just this relative area here is my entire piece is warped. And also I have a flip operation and I want to make sure that when I flip it over that the bottom side that's touching the bottom of the machine is actually going to be the top of the coffee table. So this setup is done. You may notice over here that there's a time estimate next to my toolpath, but I need to just ignore that because I haven't set up the feeds and speeds, so it's inaccurate. Next thing to do is create a new setup, and this is going to be for the flip side of the material. So first thing to do is reset my Z again, and then I'm going to go to that corner there. I'm just going to flip the cube around. And then I'm going to go over to my stock and set my fixed size box. So my width is 65, my depth is 24, but this time my Z is going to be 1 1/4 inches because I've already shaved 1/2 inch off. So it's not 1.75 anymore, it's 1.25. The next thing I need to do is change my model position. So the first thing to note is that my current model position is once again slap bang in the middle. But this time my offset is going to be from the bottom and my offset is going to be 0. Because that's the side of the wood that is my tabletop, and that's what my facing operation was all about with the last setup. Next thing to do is set up the offset from this corner because that's going to be the flip where the wood was moved. So the width X is going to be offset from the left side, and again, it's just 1 inch. And I can hit OK. Next one I'm going to do is drilling. So I want to drill these holes where my threaded inserts are going. So I'm going to change my tool, and I'm going to use my 3/8 inch drill bit. And then I'm going to pick the geometry that I want to cut. So all I have to do is select one, and then go over here and hit select same diameter. And Fusion will just pick up every other one of those holes that has the same diameter and set them up in the same toolpath for you. Lastly, you can go through to cycle and change the type of drilling that you're doing. Say, for example, you've got a really deep hole. You wouldn't want to use a rapid out, which would just go straight in and straight back out again. You'd want to use something like chip breaking or deep drilling to make sure you get a nice clean hole. So with that done, I can just hit OK. And the next thing I need to do is pocket the inside out. One of the things I like to recommend when you're setting up a CAM toolpath is to work from the inside outwards, with the outside basically being the edge of the total piece itself. That way you know that things are going to be nice and clean. Unless you've got full holes in the center or something, you may want to do that last. So I'm going to go to 2D, and I'm going to pick 2D pocket. And then under tool, I'm going to select my 1/2 inch flat end cutting bit. Then I need to select the geometry of the pocket that I want to cut, which is there. And under passes, I'm going to have stock to leave. So I'm going to leave a little bit on the underside and a little bit on the edges. And the reason for that will be clear in a minute. Then I'm going to go to multiple depths, and I'm going to set my maximum roughing step down to 1/10 of an inch again. And I'm going to set my maximum step over to be 0.3 of an inch. Now the reason I'm using stock to leave is if I cut this and didn't use stock to leave, then there'd be very clear edge lines across the inside of my pocket where the toolpath has come along and touched this. But if I have stock to leave on and then do another finishing pass which goes all the way to the bottom and just takes everything off in a single pass, I'm going to have nice clean edges here. So I'm going to leave stock to leave on and hit OK. My toolpath comes in, and then I'm going to go to 2D and then 2D pocket again. And this time in my passes, I'm going to switch stock to leave off and turn on finishing passes. My finishing passes step over is going to be 0.1, and I'm going to do 2 finishing passes and then just hit OK. And you see you've got the finishing pass that comes through and just makes everything nice and clean. Next up, I'm going to do my contour. So I'm going to go to 2D and then 2D contour and pick this edge. Now the reason I'm doing the contour next and not the chamfer is I want to minimize the number of times I have to change the tool. So if I have my drill first and then the 3 operations using the same bit all lined up together, I won't have to change the tool as many times, which is going to reduce the amount of time it takes to make the thing. So my tool is still the 1/2 inch flat. That's my contour. And next I want to go over to my passes, and I want to switch on multiple depths. And I'm going to go down by 1/10 of an inch again. And then I want to add a ramp. So what the ramp does is rather than just dropping and plunging down to the height that you want to cut and sliding across, the ramp will actually come in at a slope. And that's better for your material, and it's better for your bit too. It's going to increase the longevity of your tool's lifespan, and it's also going to make sure that you minimize the amount of unnecessary chipping or like nasty areas that show up on the final piece itself. So I can just go ahead and hit OK. And that's good to go. Now the last thing to do is the chamfer itself. So if I go to 2D and then 2D chamfer, and I set my bit to my countersink, nope, not my countersink, I want my 60-degree countersink, my 1 inch 60-degree countersink. And I want to pick my chamfer, but Fusion wants to select an edge. Now that's not the end of the world. What I can do is go over to the model space and suppress that chamfer there. So if I right click on where it is in the timeline, you'll see you have an option called suppress features. Now the difference between delete and suppress, you can see it's hidden it. So it's ghosted it out, but it's still in the timeline. So basically Fusion is just skipping over that step and continues with the rest of the timeline as you set it up. Now if I go back over to the cam space, you'll see that there's a red exclamation mark next to all of my toolpaths. And the reason for that is Fusion has detected the change and just needs you to regenerate them. So I can right click on this and hit generate toolpath and do the same for the one above, and you'll see everything's fine again. Now I can go through and hit 2D and then 2D chamfer, select the edge that I'm chamfering, make sure I've got my correct chamfer tool set up, and then I can do this in a single pass, and I'm going to do a chamfer width of 1/4 and hit OK. Now you've got to make sure, like me, that you didn't put it in the wrong place. So you can see, because this is the setup that was active, it's dropped it there. I can just drag it and throw it into where it needs to be, and then generate the toolpath, and we're fine. So it's really handy that Fusion allows you to do that, and it's something that is worth noting, that if you've put something in the wrong setup, you can just drag it and drop it in the right one, and then just generate the toolpath, and everything's going to run just fine. So the last thing I want to do is simulate this, so I have a good idea of what's going to happen before I actually start cutting my material. So I'm going to right click on Setup 9 and hit Simulate. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that my toolpath is switched on, and I like to use the mode tail, but you have a bunch of different options here if you prefer to use these for your visualization. Next I'm going to switch on the stock, and I like to use the wall paint material. I find it's just a little bit easier to see what I'm looking at. And then last thing I'm going to do is just switch off my actual component itself and only look at the stock getting cut. And then I can hit play. So the first thing it's doing is the drilling. That's going through, looks nice. I can grab this slider here to just speed things up, because it is just a simulation after all. I just want to make sure that my piece is being cut the way that I expect it to be cut. So that's the pocket going through. Everything looks fine. And then finishing pass, that's the contour, and then the chamfer. And you can see we've gone the whole way through my material. Everything's looking really good, and I'm really happy with that. One thing to note that you may want to do, depending on the machine you have and the material you have, for that contour, if I edit this and go to my heights, you may want to set your bottom height not to the actual contour itself, but a little bit further down than that. So I'm going to have my selected bottom height contour be the selected contour, so it's cutting down to that height. But I'm going to set an offset of -0.1. And now when I hit OK and zoom in on that, you'll see that the toolpath keeps going beyond the depth of the material. And that's helpful because it's going to make sure that I've actually cut the whole way through the thing in case I made any errors with my measurement or if there's any discrepancies in the material itself. Now that everything is set up, I can post-process this, so I can output the G-code I need. So for the first setup, all I have to do is right-click on it and hit post-process. And then you're just going to want to pick the post-processor that your machine uses, set your program number, and hit OK. However, for these ones down here, I'm using 3 different tools, but the shotbot doesn't have the ability to switch the tools out for me. So I need to output my, my paths manually. So I'm going to right-click on the first one and hit post-process, and then put that one out. And then I can hit, click the first one of my pockets using the half-inch end mill, and hold down Shift and pick all of the other ones that I know are using that same one, and post-process those independently. And then lastly, post-process my last one. Alright, that's it for this tutorial series. The next video is going to be the build video. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. Leave me a comment in the comment section below if there's something you want to see me do, you got any additional questions, or maybe you got an idea for a project you want me to build. Don't forget as well to watch part 1 and 2 this tutorial series as well. There'll be a playlist linked in the description below, and probably somewhere over here, the last tutorial. Catch you next time.